Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the FLEL Priestley Memorial Lecture in the History of Ideas here at our lovely Paul Cadario Conference Center. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I'm the acting principal of University College. For those of you who do not know me, I am a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in the study of language variation and change. So today is day 2 of a series of lectures focused on intellectual encounters between Europe and Asia in the 17th century. Tonight's focus is on the United Dutch East India Company, or VOC. But before we begin, I want to set us off in a good way by situating us in place. How many of you think about place? A lot of time place is self-evident because it goes beneath our radar, but really place is critical to our sense of self and well-being. We all have places and know places that are important to us, places where we feel comfortable and where people know our names. When we think of place, we probably start with specific places that we know on Earth's surface and specific topographies or landscapes. Take Toronto, we get a picture of what it looks like. How many of us see the CN Tower, for example? There may also be characteristic sounds like TTC buses or the sound of robins. There might be characteristic smells. Right now, the smell of earthy wet as the snow melts. Place is personal, but it's also political. Place is constantly in the news, debated and fought over, and always has been. Place can also be sentimental, like our homes, perhaps the most resonant place we know, where we feel safe. Or the place we gravitate to, like here, in pursuit of our interests. So let us begin by remembering the place under our feet, the land where the University of Toronto operates, which has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We're fortunate to have the opportunity to live and work in this place. As we contemplate other histories and places this afternoon, let us keep our feet well grounded. The FEL Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas originate in the support provided by several, but I understand now many, of Professor Priestley's former students. The lectures reflect Professor Priestley's broad interest in history and his dedication to teaching and to scholarship. Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam is a good example of this. He is Distinguished Professor and Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Social Sciences at the University of California in LA. He is a specialist in the history of the 15th to 18th centuries, focusing on studies of early modern European empires and their relationship with India and the Indian Ocean. Yesterday, we learned about a very eclectic Italian with some quite peculiar tastes, but he had a large impact on the impression and interpretation of relationships between Europe and Persia. Today, we will discover the contributions of the Netherlands in this scenario. But before we introduce Professor Subrahmanyam from a disciplinary perspective, let us consider our housekeeping rules for the way the lecture works. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed on to you during the question and answer portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand to ask a question once the lecture concludes. Please do speak into the microphone rather than speaking without one, because we have an audience online right now who will want to hear your questions. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Use the chat function to submit your online questions, and someone in the room will ask them for you. I now call upon Associate Professor Joe Sharma to introduce our distinguished speaker. Joe?
Thank you, Sally. My name is Joita Sharma. I'm a cultural historian an ecologist, and a community-engaged scholar of environment, foodways, and justice. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam, who delivers today the second Priestley Memorial Lecture. Professor Subrahmanyam has taught and practiced history all over the world, from Delhi to Paris, Cambridge, Oxford, and finally to his current stint in California. In that long and distinguished career, Sanjay has not only been a distinguished creator of connected histories, he has also effectively acted as a pioneer in connecting historians, archives, and linguistic cultural worlds. In doing so, indeed, he has inspired many of us across generations to seek to recover what history means to us, the pleasure, the passion, the excitement, especially the history of ideas, people, cultures, movements. I want to explain a little bit of what that means. And I speak here very personally also as somebody who first encountered Sanjay's work as a student in the Delhi University, where it was astonishing to us to think that here was somebody who lived in the global south as we did, had studied there, but was ranging all over the world in the ideas he brought to us. And it really brought up possibilities of what could be done. And so for that, I thank you, Sanjay. But for many of us here, we became scholars because of our love of a particular discipline, in this case, perhaps history. Yet, over time, seemingly inevitably, we become boxed into a particular set of practices, of sources, of languages, of subdisciplinary fields. Indeed, at times it seems that we don't do history. We do, very, very narrow bits of things. Yes, there are and were good reasons for that, for specialization. But just as Sanjay pointed out yesterday, there are no lone heroic actors in history. The historian or the scholar too needs to be connected and to visit the possibilities of connections beyond what we ourselves do, to connect both to fellow practitioners and, of course, to their readers and audiences, as well as to ideas as they evolve, circulate, and connect. And I also allude here in Sanjay's long and distinguished CV to the ways in which he has actually worked with other scholars and which has enabled him to go beyond the 8 or 9 languages that he works with. It may be more, but to actually get to that connecting history across time and sphere, but not just history, into the humanities more broadly, to connect worlds and to have the imagination to do so. Not all of us can engage in that way. Yet, we can all seek out people through whom we can connect disparate worlds and challenge silos, whether within South Asian academia, where historians who read Pashto rarely speak to those who read Tamil, or those who read Tibetan rarely speak to those who read Ohomia, just as those who read Catalan rarely engage with those who read Farsi. In all of this and much more, we can learn from and be inspired by Sanjay, just as my peers and I were 30-odd years ago when we devoured what was in that era a truly distinguished collection of scholarly books at the Ratan Tata Library at Delhi School of Economics, and we heard of the economic historian, as he was then, who had helped bring those books there. And again, I speak with feeling, because books are knowledge. We live in an era when books and ideas are being assaulted. And I want to remind us all today in this fitting venue of a lecture series on the history of ideas, the power of ideas and of sharing ideas. So today we explore with Sanjay, far from those distant groves of economic history, a diverse range of 17th century Eurasian intellectual encounters, starting with language and philology, going into tropical botany, including an ethnographic approach to religions via Italian, Persian, Dutch, German, English, French, and Iberian interlocutors, and possibly more. The title of the second lecture is Going Dutch, the VOC and its Radar. Over to Sanjay. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyita. So today we move both in space, in European space, and indeed in Asian space, but we also move within the 17th century somewhat. But I want to start actually at the very beginning of the 17th century. Before doing that, I want to just give you an example of what I call the VOC and its radar. This is the very famous Atlas Blau, which was printed in Amsterdam in the 1660s. And it's actually the end product of a whole bunch of materials which were collected in the previous decades by various employees of the Dutch companies. There were many of them. There was the Dutch East India Company, which is my main focus today, the Dutch West Indies Company, which I will be talking about, but only briefly. But also before that, there had been other smaller companies, often representing one or the other of the Dutch provinces. So here then is rather perversely a German map of the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, as you can see over here, was initially a part of the Habsburg domains of Charles V and Philip II, then rebelled against them in the celebrated Dutch revolt beginning around the 1580s. And eventually, as we know, this created a space which was separated into two parts, what eventually became the United Provinces, the northern part of this, here colored in green and pink, and then what the Spaniards would call Las Provincias Obedientes, which is to say what is today to us Belgium. That is to say, which remained with the Habsburgs and which remained dominantly Catholic, as opposed to the northern part, which came progressively more and more, though never entirely, Protestant. So which moved through Calvinism and other forms of Protestantism into a religiously distinct identity, not merely in respect of the Habsburgs, but in relation to their southern neighbors in the Flanders and Brabant. Now, in the course of this separation, the Dutch, who had always been interested in Asia in the course of the 16th century, became even more so. Here are two examples of the Dutch interest in Asia from the earlier part of the 16th century. On the left, you see a printed text which refers to the presence of somebody from the Netherlands in the second voyage of Vasco da Gama to Asia in 1502. It's a narrative account of this voyage written by a Dutchman. And it is actually called usually Kalkoen because that was the way in which he deformed the word calicut. On the right, you see a document from the Portuguese archives, which actually, from the Fragmentos, which actually reflects the fact that there were Dutchmen being employed by the Portuguese, even within their enterprise, so long as these Dutchmen, of course, were not perceived by them as politically or otherwise problematic. So the Dutch had long been interested, but this interest only began to crystallize in the last decades of the 16th century and eventually turned into something quite formidable in the 17th century. By the 17th century then, the Dutch were being perceived by their neighbors, including their much larger neighbors, as a formidable powerhouse of economic activity, but also as an interesting space from various other, even cultural points of view. So here is a French account about Les Délices de la Hollande, which actually talks about various aspects of the Netherlands, including their system of government, very peculiar system of government, which was a quasi-monarchy, where there was no king, but there was a prince, the prince of the House of Orange. And then there was an assembly called the States General, which took many of the collective decisions, made up amongst other things, of the bourgeois merchants who were painted in the famous paintings of the Netherlandish school of the 17th century. So here's a very admiring description of it. The author says that one can say with just reason that Holland is in some sense the core of the Low Countries and its beauty and fertility and so on, to say nothing of its voluptuity and its delicious aspects. It's a kind of a terrestrial paradise. and it has prairies and gardens and lands which can be cultivated, so on. So this is the sort of upside of the Netherlands. Not everybody was quite so admiring. So, for example, the English, who had a long-standing rivalry with the Dutch in the 17th century, for example, wrote a somewhat less complimentary account of the Low Countries. It said, "It is the great bog of Europe. There is not another such marsh in the world that's flat. It's a universal quagmire. It is the buttock of the world, full of veins and blood, but no bones in it." So this is, of course, making fun also of the terrain of the Netherlands, but there's an implicit criticism also of people who might live in such a terrain which is present. So not everybody had, shall we say, an equally complementary view of the Dutch, but nobody could deny that in the 17th century they had become a very formidable economic and therefore implicitly also a political, and indeed, though less recognized, and sometimes disguised by the Dutch themselves, also a cultural force. Right? Now, here are two works which actually, modern works, which actually explore that aspect of the Dutch in the 17th century as a cultural force. The very well-known book by Simon Schama, where The Embarrassment of Riches, where he actually talks about what Dutch culture in this so-called golden age was, and actually a former faculty member of the University of Toronto, Timothy Brooke, who wrote this other very interesting, somewhat more popular book called Vermeer's Hat, in which what he does is he takes some paintings of Vermeer and takes apart all the objects you can find in them and tries to show how they actually originate from very distant parts of the world. And so therefore, sitting, so to speak, in a room in the Netherlands, you can actually come to see how this room itself and its objects are constructed, and what the network is, which actually creates such a room. So we have such explorations, and I, of course, can add other works written more from the point of view of an economic history. Jonathan Israel's work on Dutch primacy in world trade, or the work of two of our Dutch colleagues on the Dutch overseas empire in a more recent sort of synthetic exploration. Now, what I want to do today is to take a slightly different angle on the Dutch in the 17th century. My focus will be primarily Asia, not, as I said, the rest of the Dutch presence in the world, which I remind you included parts of North America, parts of South America, parts of West Africa, Southern Africa, and a good part of Asia, ranging all the way from Mocha, which you see at the mouth of the Red Sea, through India, through Malaysia and Indonesia, and heading all the way to Taiwan, Formosa, as it was called at the time, and Japan. So the Dutch had this vast presence spreading across an enormous space. And so I will mention briefly some of the other aspects of this presence, because they are actually connected in curious and important ways. But my focus will be on the Asiatic side of it. And I want to actually look at the Dutch essentially as cultural actors, rather than the more familiar version we have of them, which is as merchants and as commercial actors. Now, the beginning for the Dutch, of course, is roughly here. I mean, we can take it back, but this is perhaps the first early and important intervention in regard to Dutch cultural production about Asia. And this is the text of Jan Haugen van Linschoten, who was actually employed as a spy. I mean, he was officially employed as a secretary, but he was really a spy, working for the Portuguese Archbishop in Goa. And in the course of working as a secretary, he gathered together a vast amount of commercial and other information regarding Asia, which he then took back to the Netherlands and published as a book, which then became a kind of a guidebook for the activities of the Dutch East India Company to be subsequently formed, right? So this contained various maps, it contained various illustrations. Some of them were fairly accurate, like this map of Goa and the mouth of the Mandovi, but there are other aspects of it which are much more fanciful, partly because the illustrator who put these engravings down obviously had no real visual material to work with regard to Asia, and simply fantasized somewhat about it. So this is the illustrator's view of what the marketplace in Goa looked like, which I assure you it's highly improbable that the marketplace in Goa looked anything like this. So this sort of textual production begins then at the very end of the 16th century. And here then is some basic chronology which we need to keep in mind. The Dutch begin to explore Asia through a series of small companies which are competing with one another, usually belonging to one or the other province, like Zeeland or something of this kind. This is a phase of 7 years. The competition is disastrous. The market is oversupplied. The prices crash. And so then it is decided that the only way in which the matter can be resolved is to create a monopoly company which will bring together all the companies. Right? So there is a political intervention to create what is called the United East India Company in 1602, which has a charter received from the States General and confirmed by the Prince of Orange. Now, once this company is set up, this company, let us remember, is 2 years later in its setting up than the English East India Company, created by Queen Elizabeth in 1600. And this company is vastly better capitalized than the English company. It has much more by way of resources, and this translates into ships, it translates into men, as we'll see presently, and it translates also into a capacity to diversify geographically. The Dutch then begin with a series of interventions. They avoid actually violently intervening in India at the beginning, mainly to avoid the Portuguese, and they avoid the Western Indian Ocean somewhat as well, and they go towards Southeast Asia. So their first important acquisition is Jakarta, which they rename as Batavia. And that is 1619. They build a fortress there. And this becomes the headquarters of their operations for the subsequent almost 2 centuries. Right? The Dutch also are interested in the Atlantic at the same time. Right? So the Dutch, roughly at the same moment when they're doing this, are trying to push into the Atlantic. The first place into which they push is, of course, their famous colony at the mouth of the Hudson River, which becomes New Amsterdam, subsequently New York. And in the 1630s, they also move into Brazil, and they attempt to seize the very rich sugar-producing lands in Brazil in the region of Bahia and Pernambuco. Now, this is an experiment which will fail. The Portuguese and their allies will push back over a space of 25 years, and the Dutch are obliged to abandon Brazil in the middle of the 1650s. But by this time, they have consolidated in Asia. They've consolidated because they have not only now in a position to have extensive trade in Southeast Asia, they have wound up being the exclusive Europeans who are left in Japan. No other European from about 1640 is allowed to trade in Japan. They have a presence on the coast of China. They have a presence in Taiwan. And they have a considerable presence on the coasts of India, in the Persian Gulf, and in the Red Sea, as well as in East Africa. So they've got all of this. And plus, in 1652, they found the Cape Colony, which will eventually become the basis, of course, of the European expansion into the whole Southern African area. Okay. The further consolidation of all of this would take place in a series of wars against the Portuguese between 1658 and 63, the conquest of Sri Lanka, conquest of a whole series of outposts on the west coast of India and Kerala, and further north. So they are, by this time, let's say by the 1660s, by far the dominant European presence in Asia. The English come a distant second, the Portuguese come third, and then we have a few others, some odds and ends. There's some Danish presence a little bit here and there, and occasionally somebody else will send an expedition like the Genoese at one point in the 1640s, which doesn't add up to very much. So the Dutch are, in a way, the one lot of people who are covering the whole of this Asiatic maritime space. They're, of course, as I said, also in the Atlantic, at least briefly. This is a view of their settlement in Manhattan as seen from Staten Island. And you can actually see several bits and pieces of a geography which includes some aspects which people are often intrigued by, such as the fact that, of course, the end of the Dutch settlement was the Wall. And that is, of course, where the Wall Street is, right? So that's exactly the origins of that geography. And of course, we have the attempts at geography around the Hudson Valley, which you can see over here, and their interest in both beavers and perhaps even turkeys, as we can suspect from this drawing. Now, as I said, the Dutch were the biggest operators. So here's a sense of how big they were. So this is the number of workers employed, both free and unfree, by the Dutch East India Company. So in 1625, they employ about 15,000 people. By 1688 or 1700, that's grown to between 40,000 and 46,000 people, right? About slightly less than a half of these people are Asians and Africans. There are a substantial number of unfree Asians and Africans amongst these. There are also quite a number of Europeans. As you can see, there's about 25 to 28,000 Europeans employed by them by the end of the 18th century. This is much more substantial, again, than most of the other companies. Where do these people come from? Okay, so let's be somewhat clearer about this. So if you can look at this map, you will realize that by far the largest number of Dutch company employees, so here I'm talking about the second half of the 17th century, come from that region which is marked A, right? Which is essentially the Netherlands, and especially the northern provinces of the Netherlands. But some of the other aspects are somewhat more interesting, perhaps surprising. The second largest number, which is marked as D on the chart to the left, actually are people who come from what would today be Germany. There are, in fact, a very substantial number of German employees. Okay, and these German employees will grow in numbers with a specific chronology. That is to say, once the 30 Years' War is over in 1648, there is a large number of demobilized soldiers floating around in Germany, and many of these people will be recruited by the Dutch East India Company. So actually, there are a large number of German speakers in the Dutch company, and this actually is quite curious because I remember that, you know, since I learned Dutch by reading Dutch documents, sometimes when I tried to say something in the Netherlands, people would say, well, you're actually speaking some kind of fake German, because my vocabulary had been affected by the fact that I was reading what these people were writing. So you have these Germans. Then you can see that the third set are people who come from the area marked B, which is essentially going up the Baltic. In green, and then you have F, which is people recruited from France, and then the numbers start diminishing. There are small numbers of Englishmen, and then there are also some people from Southeastern Europe. So the thing to be borne in mind is that the Netherlands proper, and then Germany, and then the Baltic are the three most important recruiting areas for what is ostensibly a Dutch East India Company, but which is clearly not just a Dutch East India Company. Now, we know that the Dutch were, of course, in the 17th century, and it's not a coincidence, also in a phase of enormous explosion in terms of visual arts and visual production. Right? Here are two perhaps well-known, well, one certainly extremely well-known analysis of this, and the other interesting from my point of view because it actually deals with it in relation to Asia. The Berkeley art historian Svetlana Alpers wrote this very famous book called The Art of Describing, in which she actually talks about what Dutch art was fundamentally about in relation to, let's say, earlier Netherlandish, but also earlier art from, let's say, Central Europe, how, according to her, progressively they stripped away certain kinds of religious symbolism or reduced it in terms of its importance, became much more interested in actually the physical art of description. And in a way, her argument is that even when you get someone, let's say, painting a religious topic or even a biblical topic amongst the 17th century Dutch painters, what is really curious is the attention which is given to empirical detail, even in those paintings. So what empirical detail consists of when you're trying to restitute the world of the Old Testament is an interesting question. What empirical detail is that? So this is an important work which set off a debate at the time that it was published and subsequently. And then you have on the right a book by two important scholars, Thomas da Costa Kaufmann and Michael Nort, Nort, to whom I will return, where they actually talk about what the Dutch actually did in terms of material culture in Asia, and which speaks much more directly to what I'm going to talk about today. Now, Nort is someone who has actually tried to actually produce some kinds of estimates of the kinds of production which was going on at this time in the Netherlands. So here's his sense of the numbers of painters and publishers in the Netherlands through the 17th century. And you can see that it's growing, reaches a peak somewhere around the third quarter of the century and then begins to decline. He's also produced a rather, to my mind, astonishing table, which is an estimate, not a census, an estimate of the numbers of paintings that there are, which I'll come to in a minute. So this confirms various descriptions, French descriptions, for example. Here's a French visitor to the Netherlands who says that I don't believe anywhere else that there are as many good painters as there are here. And every house is full of very good paintings. And even if you're a relatively poor bourgeois, you actually have some paintings in your house. And so he also points out that everyone can find a patron if you mecenas, if you actually require one, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of a whole series of such visits to the Netherlands and in particular to Amsterdam, which confirm this idea. So coming back to Nort's estimates, so these are, as I said, somewhat surprising estimates of the production of painting in the Netherlands in the course of the 17th century. So he claims that, of course, this is a progressively growing production of new paintings, but then also the production to date. So he claims that probably by the end of the 17th century, there was something like 6 million paintings that had been produced in the Netherlands. Right? Now, of course, we don't mean 6 million night watches. Right? We mean 6 million paintings of various sizes, starting from extremely small landscapes, which might be in a relatively modest house, to what would be some of the great masterpieces that are exhibited today in the museums of the world. So there is an enormous production, and that means also implicitly that there is a very sizable body of artists and painters. Now, as it turns out, at least some of these artists and painters were involved in the overseas enterprise. Right? Now, I'm starting with two of the most famous, right? Franz Post and Albert Eckhout. Okay? Now, neither of these have to do with Asia. They both went to Brazil at the time when the Dutch were in Brazil between the 1630s and 1650s. Now, the interesting thing about them, so the Eckhout paintings are today in Copenhagen. The Post paintings are in various places, but especially in the Louvre. Now, the problem with them is that especially Post produced two kinds of paintings. One is paintings he produced while he was in Brazil. And then he produced sort of ersatz paintings after he came back from Brazil, and people said, oh, these Brazilian paintings of yours are terribly interesting. So he then produced more, except that these later paintings seem to have been much more the products of his sort of fairly loose imagination. Right? So there's the art of describing, to be sure, but there's also the art of, shall we call it, pseudo-describing. And in the case of Eckhout, you can see this even more. I mean, Eckhout has this tendency to really let his imagination run wild. So, for example, on the left here, you have a cannibal woman who actually has got the hand of somebody in her hand and has actually got a foot peeping out of the basket, which is on her back. So this is, clearly extremely colorful. Shall we say, not exactly a recreation, but a colorful imagination of what, let's say, cannibal population in Brazil would have looked like at this time. So these are the best known, as I said. But in fact, there are a whole bunch of painters who actually went to Asia. And these painters have only recently started attracting our attention. Now, first, we have the painters who didn't leave us any paintings of Asia. Now, this is a very interesting character whom I've been trying to find out something about for a long time, this is a man who actually was sent to Surat in Gujarat, and he was in the Surat factory. And the Mughal court found out about him. And so they kept trying to persuade the Dutch to send him to the Mughal court. And the Dutch persistently refused. He seems eventually to have gone there for a brief time and come back. But unfortunately, we have none of his Asiatic paintings. All we have are the paintings he made when he was in the Netherlands. So this is Isaac Kudek, and we are left to wonder what he actually did in Asia. All we know is what he did in the Netherlands. But with other people, we are luckier. Now, this is a person who has now begun to attract some attention, and this is an important painter. For the longest time, he was known only for this painting. This is a painting of Jakarta or Batavia, seen from the outside. You can see the castle at a distance, and this is the bazaar on the other side of the river. This is Isaac Beekman, lived a relatively short life, 36 years. But as I said, for the longest time, he was known for this oil painting, which is today in the Rijksmuseum. But fortunately, we have actually now been able to find a whole extremely interesting collection of his watercolors. And these watercolors fall into different categories. There are watercolors of flora and fauna, but there are also an extremely interesting set of ethnographic watercolors. And these ethnographic watercolors, which today are to be found in Paris, which were in a private collection, show various types in especially Southeast Asia. So you can see, for example, here on the left, someone who is meant to be a Eurasian, and therefore dressed in sort of semi-westernized clothing. You have someone who is supposed to be a Batak forest dweller. And you similarly have other drawings of various different social types in different parts of Sumatra and Java for the most part, but there are also some drawings which seem, or paintings which seem to come from Madagascar. So he actually covers a fair swathe of territory in Southeast Asia and in island Asia more generally. Now, Beekman did not, in fact, leave us extensive texts. Some of these have captions, many of them do not. Okay, but he influenced other people. He also influenced, for example, some other Dutch and especially Germans who went to Taiwan and produced drawings of Taiwan in this period. So Formosa, as you can see described over here. Here, for example, is the other drawings of Caspar Schmalkalden, who was in Taiwan in the 1640s and who made his own drawings. So these are actually not of the Chinese settlers in Taiwan, but of the indigenous population which was there preceding the Chinese settlement and colonization of the island. And as you can see, it's accompanied by a short and rather strange poem in German on the top. So you actually have, we know that Schmalkalden and Beekman were in contact. Because actually Schmalkalden's wrote a travel account which is published, and that published account seems to use some of Beekman's illustrations as well. So you can also see that several of these people are actually working with one another. Okay, now, how do they go about making these drawings and making these paintings? So obviously there is the kind of art of describing, the art of sketching in a place, to which we will return time and again. So there is a kind of an ethnographic visual production which is being engaged in, which has various styles and which has various distinct purposes. But we know that the Dutch also did something starting probably, is my guess, in the 1620s, but certainly from the 1630s onwards, which is that they started buying Mughal paintings. Right? Now, this was much easier said than done. Right? Because Mughal paintings were not on the market in general. That is to say, the products of the Mughal atelier were not meant to be sold. They were meant to be gifted. They were meant to be kept by the Mughals. They were not meant to be acquired by other people, so to speak, on the free market. So how did they acquire them? This is already a bit of a mystery. We know that in the case of at least one collection of paintings, which is today in the Vatican, it was stolen. It was stolen by a Jesuit priest who was in Agra. And we know that it was stolen for a specific reason, which is that some of the paintings are actually half finished. So he obviously got hold of them before they had finished the whole album. They include genealogical paintings, they include paintings of some of the princes, and so on. Now, how exactly the suppliers of the Dutch East India Company got hold of their paintings, we don't know. And in some instances, we don't even have the paintings themselves. But what we do have is versions of these paintings made by Dutch painters. This, most famously, are 2 of the 22 or 23 sketches that Rembrandt made of Mughal paintings, right? So there are 2 paintings with very distinct purposes. On the left is a portrait of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan with his oldest son, Dara Shikoh. And on the right, you see a kind of metaphorical painting which represents the hypothetical meeting of the founders of the 4 great Sufi orders. Okay. But Rembrandt on the right-hand side has rearranged the painting in the sense that he has given us perspective. He has rearranged the tray with the little glasses, little cups of tea in the beginning. But he's remained fairly faithful to the composition. He's remained extremely faithful to the physiognomy. So we know that these were paintings that were coming through in this period, and the Dutch were actually copying them, using them. But why? What were they meant to be doing with these things? Now, in the case of Rembrandt, we have a fairly clear hypothesis, at least, because he never tells us what he was doing. And it seems that what Rembrandt was actually doing with these paintings was, in fact, to use them as a way of accessing the ancient world. So his idea was that he would take these paintings of the Mughal court and so on, and he would populate his paintings of the world of the Old Testament with these paintings. Not in the literal sense that, for example, he was not interested he was certainly enough of an empiricist to know that people, let's say in the story, a time of Samson and Delilah, did not dress like people in the Mughal court. But he believed, and this is something which he doesn't say, but some other people of the time say, he believed that actually in their gestures, in their body movements, in the way they held their bodies, and so on, the people in the East or in the Mughal court and so on still preserved in a perfectly frozen form the gestures and hand movements and body movements of the ancient world, whereas in the West, things had moved on. So he believed that, for example, if he wanted to, there is the famous painting of Abraham receiving the angels, that he believed that he could take something like this and he could, in a way, transpose some elements of it into his portrayals of the ancient world. So Rembrandt never actually portrayed Asia in the 17th century. That was never an object for him, except in the sketches. He never painted a painting which was, let's say, a painting of Asia in the 17th century. But he did use it, and he did pay a lot of attention, because, 22 sketches are a sizable body of sketches to have produced, which are fairly varied, moreover, in their themes and usages. Now, there was another interesting contemporary of Rembrandt, on the other hand, who had access to exactly the same Mughal paintings, but who actually decided to use them to make paintings of what he imagined was Mughal India. This is Willem Skellings. We have 4 paintings of his in the Mughal style. I've discussed them at some length in a previous publication. So I'll just mention the fact that he made these 4 paintings. This is one which is of Shah Jahan and his 4 sons on a hunt, right? And it's an interesting thing because it's a composition which draws on at least 4 or 5 different Mughal paintings. Now, what is interesting is that the 4 sons have the exact same face, because he wasn't able to actually get 4 different faces for the 4 of them. But Shah Jahan has a face which is distinct and, in fact, corresponds to Shah Jahan's face from Mughal paintings. But it also has other things you probably can't see, but there are rather strange, exotic themes he's added. He has a Brazilian parakeet there, which must have come from another painting. And he also has an elephant and a rhinoceros who are fighting somewhat in the dark in the background. So what exactly this is, I don't know. I mean, he might have been aware of the fact that in the Mughal court, there were elephant fights between 2 elephants, but there were certainly not fights between an elephant and a rhinoceros. So we have someone like this who's, again, absorbing the same paintings, but using them in a different way, not in order to do what Rembrandt is doing, which is a very complicated and sort of subtle exercise. This is actually simply saying, here, let me give you a view of what my understanding of Mughal India is, even though I've never been there. We are absolutely certain that Skelling's never traveled to Asia. He had a brother who traveled to Asia, but actually that brother traveled to Asia after he had made these paintings. So you might say that the cause and effect might even be reversed in this particular case. Now, as we move further into the century, so these are still in the mid-century. Skelling's is possibly from the 1650s. Rembrandt is possibly somewhat earlier. But then as we move a little bit later, we get paintings. Now, these are different because these are actually commissioned by the Dutch East India Company. Right? So this is a series of paintings which the Dutch East India Company actually commissioned to have hanging up in its headquarters in the Netherlands. And they are meant to be representations of the Dutch so-called trading outposts of factories. So this is supposed to be one of the trading outposts in Bengal. Now, it looks very nice and schematic at a distance, but it has some curious details which you have to wonder where the artist Van Schalenberg got them from. If you look at this, for example, you will see that there are two things which are happening here. Perhaps it's not adequately clear because my image is not sufficiently high resolution, but there is a scene of a sati going on, right? On the riverbank over there, there is the body of a woman who is being burnt with her husband. So again, this is the familiar topos, which we saw already with Pietro della Valle, still living out at this point in time, where the depiction of a factory still has to incorporate this somewhere into its broader context. There's also another detail somewhere which shows someone engaging in what is called hook swinging, right? Which is this kind of self mortification where someone passes a hook through their back and then hangs over a period of time in order to for a religious expiation or a religious vow of some kind. So they also managed to fit that into the what is meant to be a very anodyne depiction of a Dutch factory. They've managed to draw these elements into it. So we have this. And on the other extreme, of course, we have the individual employees of the Dutch East India Company who would get their own portraits painted, presumably to hang in their own houses. And so this, for example, is someone who's identifiable as a prominent employee of the 1660s or 70s who is depicted with his wife and a slave or a servant holding a parasol. And this is meant to be not entirely clear whether it's meant to be Southeast Asia or whether it's meant to be somewhere in Africa. But this type of painting, in fact, barely gestures at the exotic background, doesn't really incorporate any particular elements. What is front and center is the man who's paid for the painting and his family. Though sometimes those can become interesting. There is another painting which is quite well known of someone called Cornelia van Nijenrode, who was actually half Japanese and half Dutch. And she's presented with a husband and a collective family portrait. Now, to my mind, what is interesting is to move away somewhat from the painting itself, right? Because the paintings are undoubtedly interesting, and we can do a certain number of things with them. But what is actually interesting is that over time, we have realized that just as we found the watercolors with Beekman, that actually there's a whole bunch of visual materials which never reached the stage of the painting, which remained essentially in the form of sketches and pen and ink drawings. And these are have a much more sort of immediate character. We can imagine that in terms of how they were conceived, who was meant to see them, and so on, they would have been quite distinct from the painting. The painting is meant for a certain purpose. It's meant to be displayed and so on. These other kinds of materials might have been meant for circulation in a much smaller group and would have been meant essentially for the authors to at times keep them as sort of aide-memoire along with texts that they were writing. Right? So let me give you an example of something which has only recently been discussed and come to light, right? And this is the sketchbook of a Dutch surgeon by the name of Wouter Schouten, who was in India, in Bengal, he was in Burma, and then he was in Indonesia. Scouten wrote a travel text, which was actually published, a fairly successful travel text. Now, if you look at the travel text, it's very curious because the illustrations are bad to the point of being ridiculous, right? In the sense that they have no resemblance whatsoever to what we might imagine he was intending to describe. So, for example, he has a drawing of the Mahamuni, the Buddha in Arakan in northern Burma, who's wearing something which looks suspiciously like a motorcycle helmet, and so on. But on the other hand, it's with some surprise that we find that Scouten was actually a fairly talented draftsman, though he was a medical man by profession. He was probably a barber initially who became a medical man. Now, these are his drawings, right? So if you look at these drawings, these are daily scenes from Jakarta. There are, on the right-hand side, you see some of the Chinese tombs in Jakarta, which in fact, if you look at them even today, you can see these are fairly decent descriptions. As you can see, there's considerable annotation, which goes with each of the sketches. And he actually took quite a lot of trouble to paint various scenes. So this, for example, is a very elaborate 2-page sketch of a Muslim Javanese wedding in Jakarta. So you can actually see the bride and the groom on horses. You can see various other people who are accompanying them in the procession. You can see jugglers and acrobats and so on. And he's taken quite a lot of trouble to compose the scene. And then, as you can see, he's also added his commentary and text at the bottom. Now, as I said, the interesting thing about this is that this never made it in any way, shape, or form into his published account. It remained in the form of this notebook, which was subsequently purchased and came by a very complicated route into the possession of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is where it is today. But here he is actually producing this kind of description. Now, the question, of course, which arises is what are the kinds of things that someone like Scouten is interested in drawing and interested in depicting? So it is clearly meant to be, as I said, a form of exotic ethnography. It is meant to be very actually careful in its evocation of detail. Particular attention is paid to things like textiles and costume, for example. And overall, you can see that it is meant to, at least within a small circle of people who are meant to see this. So clearly not the large number of people who would have been meant to see, let's say, Skelling's oils. The small number of people who are meant to see this are meant to get a much closer grasp of what the kind of texture of daily life looks like in a European settlement, which is, however, not entirely a European settlement because there's a very large number of non-Europeans who live there. Now, if you actually look at this set of materials, we realize after some time that these materials are by no means unique. Right? So in fact, in the second half of the 17th century, you can start accumulating more and more of these materials, which are never in the shape of paintings, which have never, therefore, been exposed in the same way or seen in the same way, but some of which are fairly dramatic, I have to say. Right? So this, for example, is a set of materials which accompanies the settlement of the Dutch in the Cape Colony. Right? Some of the most extraordinary pen and ink drawings actually from the second half of the 17th century. So this is a person whom we normally call the anonymous Cape artist because we don't know who he was, but who made these pen and ink drawings of the Cape region. But these are actually really very, very interesting ethnographic drawings of the so-called Khoi Khoi, the pastoralist populations of southern Africa, with actually quite interestingly commentaries in 2, sometimes 3 distinct hands. So we can actually see that the drawings have passed through a series of people in the East India Company, each one of whom has added his comments on it. Right? So showing aspects of pastoralist daily life in this area, showing sometimes, so in this broad Cape area that you see in this map over here, sometimes showing some quite interesting little sidelights, such as, for example, showing that by the period when this was made, 1660s or 1670s, for example, apparently the use of tobacco had already begun, for instance, in the Cape Colony. So we can see certain aspects like this, okay? But they're actually quite sometimes quite dramatic sort of natural scenes of the rains in the colony, of the Dutch reaction to actually the somewhat dramatic force of nature as they encountered it in the region, right? So a whole series of such pen and ink sketches, today preserved in Cape Town, but which seem to be roughly contemporary, actually, with Schouten's sketches coming from Batavia, except that they are actually these are pen and ink, and they're much more carefully elaborated, and the commentaries also are much more complex than the ones that we find in the other case. Okay, so this is the last one which I want to mention to you, where the man actually is drawing various a combination of various scenes, some focused on individual figures and some focused on activities with regard to animals and so on. Last of them. Now, I want to close by just speaking a little bit to the fact that these materials are not completely divorced from the world of print, right? There was some relationship finally to the world of print. Now, this is partly because of the fact that sometimes these materials were clearly used by people who produced texts. It's also because of the fact that in some of the texts that were written in this period, there is quite an extensive reflection on what artists are meant to do, what are artists trying to do, what is the purpose of producing these drawings and so on. What you see on the left, in fact, these are two texts written by the same artist, a man called Philip Angel. One is an account of the avatars of Vishnu in Dutch called Devik's Avatar. And the other is a text that he wrote in the Netherlands before he went to India, which is called In Praise of the Painterly Art, Lof de Schilderkunst. And in the left side text, he actually gives you a whole explanation for what Dutch painters are trying to do and why they're different from other kinds of painters. Now, the Dutch print in the 17th century also then put out a lot of materials of, as I said, very varying quality. Some of it could be entirely fantastic and improbable, such as Schouten's illustrations. Some of it could be, such as this, the frontispiece of Kommeland's Begin in Voortgang, is clearly an entirely symbolic and sort of metaphorical composition, right? But you also find other materials which you can find in texts, such as Baldaus's text on religion to the left, or a text by Havard called The Rise and Decline of Coromandel, end of the 17th century, which are trying to address very different kinds of materials. So, for example, in several of these Dutch texts of the second half of the 17th century, they begin to produce rudimentary but quite interesting accounts of various aspects of what they call the heathen religion, heathendom. In fact, there's a famous text from 1650s, which is called The Open Door to Concealed Heathendom. And in these kinds of texts, they actually seem to have, and usually somewhere at the center of it, there is a Dutch priest. And there is usually an interlocutor who might or might not be a Brahmin. And the Dutch priest has persuaded the Brahmin, usually in Portuguese, sometimes in Tamil, to tell him some kinds of narrative elements of what the heathens believe. Right? So here we get such stories. So for example, if you're wondering, on the left, that is the story, a rudimentary version of the story of the Ramayana on the left, right? That is Rama and Lakshmana. On the right, it is the story of Krishna, right? And you can see, his mother and then the carrying the baby away on the basket and so on. So what they're starting to do over here is use a combination of things, which is here they are not using high art like Mughal art. They're using much more, shall we say, commercial art, perhaps even painted on textiles, which is available to them, for instance, in southern India or western India. They're actually bringing them, and they're actually having their printers make engravings which are incorporating these. But they're also increasingly then making use of the fact that there is below the surface of this, there is this previous production in terms of these sketchbooks, which are not meant to be circulated beyond a small circle, but which can be used by people in order to actually move forward with their materials. Who are the people who are behind this? Well, I can't develop this too far, but let me just mention a few people who were clearly very central in this. This is the very famous mayor of Amsterdam, Nicolaas Witsen, right? Who was a collector, who was also an investor in the VOC, who was a big wheeler dealer, a personal friend of Peter the Great of Russia, and who actually, for instance, has these codex. The codex on the right, which you see, is a codex with the flora and fauna of the Cape Colony. So he's someone who, in fact, has somewhat excessive intellectual pretensions, but he's certainly someone who's able to intervene, patronize, and help get things out, right? And of course, we can see as a consequence of this, you're going to get more and more of material which is going to work itself into print, right? So by the late 17th, early 18th century, almost any Dutch book dealing with Asia will be illustrated, will often have illustrations of fairly decent quality, and which could vary from these kinds of ethnographic scenes that we have referred to here, as you can see, portraits of both the Mughal emperor, and on the left there is actually Shivaji, the Maratha. So somehow they've actually, Whitson managed to get a portrait of him and managed to get this incorporated over here. So you're actually getting this kind of floating up eventually into print as well of all of these materials. Now, what can we say about all of this? Now, clearly, there are different elements of this, and these elements are characterized by different degrees of what we might call circulation symmetry and circulation asymmetry. We can see moments in which actually representations already made in Asia outside of the Western tradition are being taken on board, used, and transformed. Sometimes they're actually not going through the mediation of a previous representation. They're actually trying to go directly to an object and produce a representation of it. And then, of course, there's the great difficulty in moving from, let's say, something like a sketch to something like a printed object or an actual painting. Right? So at the end of the day, what this whole enterprise winds up doing, of course, which is ostensibly there to make money, is actually producing a very, very sizable visual body of materials with regard to Asia. And I have literally here touched on not quite the tip of the iceberg, but a relatively small part of it, which shows what a large organization with an enormous margin of profit actually could do, sometimes because it wanted to, and sometimes because its employees had nothing better to do. Thank you.
Thank you for yet another enlightening lecture, Professor Subrahmanyam. I would like to invite Professor Subrahmanyam and Professor Sharma to the main area, or the main seating area, for a Q&A session, for which we roughly have 15 minutes left.
So thank you, Sanjay, for another invigorating lecture. For those of you who haven't read his classic piece in Society and Circulation, I would go back to that and juxtapose the more recent work, because, by the way, you inspired a graduate course that I sometimes teach called Empire and Circulation. So this was, I would say, key text that should be there for that kind of work. So thank you very much, Sanjay. And we invite questions from the audience, both the Zoom audience and the in-person audience. And we have the mic going around, so please raise your hand and look towards the mic. The sun's shining in my eyes, so I can't actually see. I think people are still processing. Over there. Yeah. Please wait for the mic. Yeah, thanks. Arafat.
I guess while we're waiting for more questions, I wanted to kind of maybe connect back to the talk yesterday, and how we might think of philology alongside the developments that you charted today. So I'm just, again, from my vantage, I'm thinking of these sort of other developments that are happening in the Dutch Academy in the 17th century. So Thomas Erpenius, of course, the first European Arabist, in a manner of speaking, right? So he writes the very influential grammar of Arabic, and then his students, Golius and others, become major figures in what I would say is the Dutch sort of contribution to the formation of Orientalism, right? So I'm wondering how you might maybe draw connections between that kind of strand of scholarly scholarship and the kind of larger, right, visual discourse that you presented on today. Thank you.
Actually, that's a very, very interesting and fecund question. So basically, so you have Erpenius and Golius, and the people in Leiden, who are sometimes even training some of the Dutch East India Company's employees. Certainly, we know that there's somebody whom I'm going to be talking about tomorrow, called Herbert de Jager, who was actually directly a student of theirs, right? So then these are people who will go into typically Mughal India, Iran, or the southern Ottoman domains, and will function using this. And so you can actually imagine, therefore, that some of the dealings with the Mughal Empire are actually facilitated by the intervention of people who have actually been trained in that tradition. So that's one way in which they intervene. But of course, the other way in which they intervene, which is a set of texts which I haven't mentioned, is that the 17th century is a moment when they begin to produce translations of Oriental texts. And sometimes those printed translations have illustrations in them, right? So for example, two of the early texts which get to be translated are the Gulistan and the Bostan of Saadi, of which there's first a Latin translation, then there's a Dutch translation, but there's also then a French translation, which is quite well known from the 1670s, right? So there you actually have a thing where, again, of course, the point is, what is an appropriate illustration for a classical Persian text? And then you have, again, this whole question of what do you use? What are the appropriate materials? Can you use a Mughal miniature or some version thereof and proceed to make it, put it into consonance with that. Again, I think that someone like Whitson is crucial here, because Whitson is connected to all of these people. He's connected to someone whom, again, I'm going to talk about a little bit tomorrow, which is a man called Adriaan Reiland. Reiland was the professor of Eastern languages in Utrecht. And Reiland then had his connections with all these people. And of course, then we also have, again, the interesting question, which is that Whitson, we know, because one of the puzzles with regard to those paintings that Rembrandt used and so on was, how did they show up? Did somebody tell the Dutch East India Company factors to go and buy Mughal paintings? Or did they do this on their own initiative because they wanted to? Now, I don't think that they actually bought them for the company. I think they bought them with the intention of interesting private collectors in the Netherlands. So this would probably have been a side trade on the part of somebody else. But there is clearly a kind of a complicated relationship between the scholarly milieu in Utrecht and Leiden, the training of people in the Islamic languages, and some of this production. So that is actually an interesting avenue, a part of which I will follow up with tomorrow. Yeah.
Any other questions? Because otherwise I'm going to jump in with So going back to the Rembrandt painting on, well, the drawing on the right, the Sufi one, and it intrigued me that you said, they have the glasses of tea in front of them because, yes, Rembrandt may well have been drinking tea because we have the Batavia tea drinking habit, which circulates
yeah.
in the Netherlands at that point, but the Sufis were not drinking tea. So that is an interesting kind of interpolation of, of what the Dutch were doing.
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting question because you see, in this instance, I think we have found the Mughal painting. Um, the Mughal painting, actually, on which this is probably based, is today in Vienna in the Schönbrunn Palace.
Just speak it to the mic.
In the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, right? It's actually very bizarre because it somehow wound up being acquired by the Habsburgs, who didn't seem to value it very much. So they actually stuck it to the walls as wallpaper, right? So you have actually about a bunch of these Mughal miniatures, stuck to the walls, and you can't take them off without damaging them, right? But this painting is actually a 17th century painting. It's a Shah Jahan period painting. And it's an interesting question because I think that Rembrandt actually changes something, which is I believe that the original painting has porcelain cups.
Yeah.
Now, what they were drinking in those porcelain cups, according to the Mughal painter, is an interesting question.
It may well have been coffee.
It may have been
But
coffee.
It wouldn't have been tea.
It wouldn't have been tea, but it may have been coffee. Or it may have
After
been
30
spirits.
years of working on tea, I can tell you that.
It would have been, it could have been coffee, though even with coffee, it's a little early. So, yeah.
Okay, so we have a virtual question here from Marlene. They say, thank you for your fascinating talk. I saw an exhibition of Dutch sketches of scenes in Asia at the Getty some years ago, if I recall correctly. But I seem to recall that exhibition also included South Asian depictions of Dutch scenes. For instance, a woman baking Dutch pancakes. I wonder whether you could comment on that fascinating phenomenon.
I didn't catch all of it.
So saw
Getty,
this
there was a
at the
exhibit?
Getty. There was an exhibit, but there were South Asian depictions of Dutch customs, I guess. So she's saying there was a painting of somebody, a woman making Dutch pancakes. Now, does she say where this is being depicted?
I'll read the last part. She says, but I seem to recall that exhibition also included South Asian depictions of Dutch scenes. For instance, a woman making Dutch pancakes. I wonder whether you could comment on that fascinating phenomenon.
Well, actually, to tell you the truth, I don't exactly know what the exhibit she's talking about is, because I mean, I do know there was an exhibit on Rembrandt and Mughal painting, and where actually, very interestingly, they had brought all the Rembrandt drawings on Mughal India, and a few of the Mughal miniatures. I mean, there's just a handful of them which you can identify and which seem to correspond to the drawings. But I'm not sure that I exactly know which exhibit this was. So if the person could actually email me and tell me what the exhibit was, perhaps I could get more precise.
Well, I can put on my food historian hat and say that it would be quite intriguing if this was actually one from Ceylon, because Dutch pancakes, and in fact, it becomes one of the foodways.
Yeah.
Through those pancakes and the appams and the hoppers and so on.
Yeah.
So that is very plausible. But yes, if we don't know which part of South Asia,
Yeah.
then it's kind of hard to hazard a guess.
She just
Thank you.
mentioned that, the Getty.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. She says that the pancake maker Mughal circa 1640 to 80 after a Dutch print by T.H. Matham.
Okay. So this is a separate kind of an issue. This is an issue where, as we know, there were also Dutch and other prints which circulated in Mughal India and which then became the basis of paintings by Mughal artists using prints, including cityscapes and various things which they did. I mean, including religious scenes, all those Dutch crucifixion scenes and various other, or even ones from Iberia, which and from the Flemish ones as well. right? So it's that kind of circulation. It's actually someone in Mughal India who is looking at a European print and then making a painting based on a European print. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
So my question was about color. I think I noticed Indian yellow in a couple of the paintings.
Yes.
And my question is really about, so how much did the Dutch artists use local pigments and palettes? And in their use of local pigments, how did these paintings in circulation influence the painters back home? And also then how could we compare them to the company painters of like the English East India or the French East India companies?
So here's the thing. Yeah, I mean, what is called, I'll come to your first question later, but what is called company painting in the context of the English company and so on. So those are often people who are working within or in the near vicinity of, the settlements such as Madras or Calcutta or Pondicherry and so on, producing paintings on commission by usually European patrons, and then in a secondary fashion, sometimes reproducing versions of those. So those are the kinds of things which normally, I mean, people like Mildred Archer and so on call company painting, right? And that's typically also the examples begin in the second half of the 18th century. Is that what you had in mind, or was it something else that you had in mind? Yeah.
A lot of perceptions of artistic use of color and so on within the local European art establishment.
Yeah.
And then, so I guess my question was because whenever I think of like Rembrandt, I think of dark palettes, whereas some of the stylists that we see here have very bright paintings and a lot of bright yellow, for example.
Yeah. So of course, note that these are not Rembrandt paintings, but they're Rembrandt drawings where there is no color, right? But effectively, it seems to me that the whole company painting tradition, I would tend to take it in a somewhat different direction, because I think that a lot of those so-called company painters were actually people who came from the textile painting tradition. Right? Which is, of course, extremely well known on the Coromandel coast, but which is also prevalent elsewhere. And so I think they are drawing both for their, thematic inspiration, and sometimes even in terms of the materials and so on. I think they're transferring that from textile to paper very often. Right? So this is what is happening in that context. Now, for me, actually, perhaps the most interesting from the point of view of your question is actually Beekman, because he's the one who is producing these watercolors, which are colored. Right? Unlike the last artists that I showed, who actually are just making either sketches or are making washes, pen and ink washes, right? So with Beekman, I think the interesting question would be to see what he did, what he actually used as materials, which so far as I know, so far has not been that much the object of analysis, though there has been one exhibit of which I showed you the catalog based on his paintings. And I think the remaining question would be, and for this, I think one would have to go back to the Dutch East India Company's archives, is to see whether ever any of these people, through Whitson or some other investor in the company, actually went and set out orders for materials through the company to Asia, saying, we want this, this, and this, because we have heard that it can be used in a more effective way. So to actually see, in the sense that we know that, say, later on, they would in the 18th century, for example, because the Dutch were the only people who had access to Japan amongst the Europeans, they would actually order Japanese materials, and we know that for a fact, including Japanese paper and so on and so forth, right? So yes, that would be an interesting question to see whether there are concrete instances of people ordering such materials in the awareness that they have possibilities that the European materials don't. Yeah.
One more question. Yes, last question here.
Thank you very much, and your fabulous images. Because I come from Southeast Asia, there are 4 countries I would like to kind of discuss with you or touch base. Starting from the furthest northeast will be Japan. The Portuguese first arrived in Japan, St. Francis Xavier doing the missionary work, then we followed by the Dutch. In fact, looking back at the Japanese history and the engagement with the West, they are quite happy with the advent of the Dutch because that opened up Western learning. They really appreciate that before the Americans come barging in, Commando Perry. Then further down would be Taiwan. In fact, the Dutch occupation in Taiwan is relatively short compared to Indonesia a few hundred years. In fact, the Taiwanese now also have fond memories of the Dutch colonization. They did not did bad things to the Taiwanese. In fact, what is interesting, because we have a Taiwanese diaspora in Toronto, they will organize annual festival, and they would be quite proud that they learn from the Western style painting tradition from the Dutch. They go back to that influence. So further down would be, first I go to Malaysia, Malacca, with the VOC and then the Dutch direct governmental rule, also a few hundred years old. But the only sort of traces left is that state house, which is now a museum. And I do not know too much about it because I'm not a trained historian or in art history. But I think the European influence in Malaysian Malacca is somehow foreshadowed by the long British influence. So apparently the Portuguese colonization or the Dutch is forgotten in the dustbin of time.
You're making a comment, or do you have a question?
I wonder if you have something to respond like Japan and then Taiwan and also Malaysia. And the last country would be Indonesia. I don't know too much about Indonesia. Again, I would have to defer to an expert like you. I wonder if you have something to say more about Indonesia because it's too many hundred years influence there in Indonesia. But one thing I'd like to add quickly, because of the Dutch colonization, in fact, at Leiden University, they have set up the IIAS, the International Institute for Asian Studies. It was established by our Act of Parliament in Holland, and they provide massive funding. It's an important center for learning within Holland for Southeast Asia, and they're doing good work. But now, because of the right-wing party influence, they're going to cut back the funding. They're asking for help for funding. Do you have anything to say about IIAS?
We only have like about a minute, so this might be something to take up in a discussion. Sanjay, unless you want to give a very brief.
Informally, I mean, it's much of what you've said is of course true, and I think that the interesting question, which I'll actually be exploring also tomorrow, is the whole question really actually of the articulation between a number of these different elements, which is, for example, the relationship between the Dutch in Japan with, for example, those in Jakarta, how it works in various ways, and how it actually influences the knowledge making which takes place in the 17th century. Yeah.
So thank you, Sanjay. And so we have really looked, I think, very amazingly circulated through ethnographies, through philology. I'm hoping there'll be more of botany, but I think also we can segue from the question about vegetable paints, because if we extend the concept of botany, materials to paper, for instance, which is involved in these kinds of artworks that we saw, into the kind of broader realm of the German collectors and so on. And I think we will be covering more of Southeast Asia as well tomorrow. And over to Sally for the last word of the day.
Thank you, Joe. Well, that ends tonight's lecture. Thank you for a really mind-boggling whirl through text and book and painting. Thank you for your questions from the audience. I'd like to take this opportunity to let you know that we have more endowed lectures of this nature coming up. We will have the R.K. Tietzel lecture. It will be given by Deanna Bowen in the Fine Arts Department at Concordia. It will be given on September 17th, same time, same place. We'll also have the S.J. Stubbs Lecture. It will be given by Professor Emily Wilson, who is from the Department of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and that will be given on October 7th. Just check the website. You'll find further details there and titles and abstracts as they become available. As you've seen yesterday and today, these lectures are fantastic opportunities to hear from world-class scholars about different times and places that can have an impact on what we know and how we proceed through the rest of our lives. I always learn something new, and I'm sure you have too. Special thanks to Joe for moderating tonight, and Bonnie manning the virtual team over there, and to all the students, staff, and faculty who have been involved in this visit. Most especially to you, Sanjay. I am certainly learning more than I have ever done before about Dutch influences in Asia, and we will look forward to the lecture tomorrow. That's it for today, folks. Have a good evening.